The easiest way to discover who people really are is to let them believe you have no power at all. On a cold Thursday evening in Manhattan, no one paid attention to the man standing beside the black sedan. The restaurant's glowing windows reflected off the wet pavement as guests in tailored suits and designer coats stepped out of luxury vehicles and disappeared through the revolving doors. The man remained outside, holding the rear passenger door open while a group of executives entered the building without even looking at him. To them, he was just another driver. Another invisible face in a city full of invisible people. Inside the Hawthorne Room, one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants, Claire Bennett adjusted the sleeve of her white uniform shirt and glanced toward the entrance as the dinner rush intensified. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light across polished wood floors. Expensive laughter floated through the room. Wine glasses clinked softly. Somewhere near the piano, a businessman closed a deal worth more money than Claire would earn in 10 years. Yet none of that interested her. What interested her was people. Real people. The ones who said thank you. The ones who smiled at servers. The ones who remembered that a uniform was not a personality. Table 12 just arrived, her manager called. Big corporate group. Treat them like royalty. Claire nodded and picked up a tray. She had heard those instructions 1,000 times before. In places like this, some customers mattered more than others, at least according to management. A few minutes later, the executives occupied the largest table in the restaurant. Expensive watches flashed beneath the lights. Assistants hurried around them. Everyone seemed eager to impress. Everyone except Claire. She simply performed her job with the same calm professionalism she offered every guest. As she approached with menus, a sudden commotion near the entrance drew her attention. One of the executives accidentally bumped into someone while removing his coat. A glass of red wine slipped from a nearby tray and splashed across the dark suit of the man standing beside the doorway. The driver. The room briefly fell. Silent. The executive glanced down. "Watch where you're standing," he muttered before turning away. A few people chuckled awkwardly and returned to their conversations. The driver looked at the stains spreading across his jacket. Then he quietly reached for a napkin. No complaint. No anger. No embarrassment. Just silence. Claire stared for a moment. Something about the scene bothered her. Without hesitation, she walked across the dining room, carrying a clean towel. "Sir," she said gently, offering it to him. "I'm really sorry that happened." The man looked up. His eyes were calm. Surprisingly calm. The kind of eyes that had seen much bigger problems than spilled wine. For a second, he seemed almost amused. "Thank you," he said. His voice was steady, confident, and far more refined than Claire expected. Most people didn't even notice. Claire smiled. "I noticed." A faint expression crossed his face. Not surprise. Not gratitude. Something deeper. As though those two simple words meant more than they should have. Then his gaze shifted briefly toward the executives laughing at their table. "That's rare these days," he said quietly. Claire handed him the towel. "Well, everyone deserves a little respect." The driver nodded slowly. Outside, rain tapped softly against the glass. Inside, the music continued, and neither of them realized that before the weekend was over, that simple exchange would change both of their lives forever. Claire returned to the dining room, but her attention kept drifting back toward the entrance. It was not because of the stained suit or the awkward scene. It was the man himself. Most people reacted when they were embarrassed. Some became angry. Others demanded apologies. Yet the driver had done neither. He had simply smiled and thanked her. The evening continued as the restaurant filled with conversations about investments, mergers, and opportunities worth millions of dollars. Claire moved gracefully between tables carrying trays of sparkling water, steaks, and expensive bottles of wine. She had learned long ago that luxury often came with noise. The louder the room became, the more she appreciated quiet people. When she passed near the entrance again, she noticed the driver sitting alone at a small table near the back corner. It was not a table reserved for important guests. In fact, it was usually given to delivery workers, chauffeurs, and anyone management considered outside the restaurant's elite clientele. Claire frowned. The executives he had arrived with occupied the center of the room beneath the chandeliers while he sat alone beside a window overlooking the rainy street. She grabbed a menu and walked over. "Have you had a chance to order yet?" she asked. The man looked up from a leather notebook resting beside his coffee cup. "No one has asked me." Claire glanced around the room. Somehow she was not surprised. Then let me fix that. A small smile appeared on his face. You seem determined to fix things tonight. Only the ones I can. He studied her for a moment before opening the menu. What would you recommend? Most customers asked that question without listening to the answer. This felt different. Claire found herself thinking carefully. The short ribs. They take 6 hours to prepare and nobody rushes them. They are probably the most honest thing on the menu. The man's smile widened slightly. Honest food. That is a rare recommendation. It is New York, Claire replied. Honesty is usually extra. He laughed softly. Not loudly. Not for attention. Just enough to make her wonder why the sound felt genuine. As she took his order, she noticed the watch resting beneath his sleeve. It was old. Not flashy. No diamonds. No oversized face. Yet something about it stood out. Claire had spent years serving wealthy clients. She knew expensive when she saw it. That watch was worth far more than the luxury models worn by most of the executives across the room. Curious. Very curious. Before she could think further, one of the managers approached. Claire. His voice was sharp. Table 12 needs you. She nodded. I will be right there. The manager glanced briefly toward the driver. Do not spend too much time back here. Focus on the guests who matter. The words hung in the air. Claire felt uncomfortable immediately. The driver said nothing. He simply lowered his eyes to the menu. After the manager walked away, Claire sighed. I apologize for that. For what? The man asked calmly. People often reveal themselves when they think no one important is watching. For a second, Claire was not sure what he meant. Then he picked up his coffee cup and looked out at the rain sliding down the glass. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled over Manhattan. And for reasons she could not explain, Claire had the feeling that this quiet stranger was paying attention to everything. The dinner rush reached its peak as rain continued to paint silver lines across the restaurant windows. Claire moved from table to table with practiced ease, but her thoughts kept returning to the stranger in the corner. Something about him refused to fit the picture everyone seemed determined to paint. Drivers did not usually wear watches like that. Drivers did not usually speak with that level of quiet confidence. And drivers certainly did not observe a room the way he did, as if every conversation mattered. An hour later, she returned with his dinner. The short ribs rested on a white porcelain plate, steam rising beneath the soft golden light overhead. I hope they live up to the recommendation, he said. If they do not, I will personally complain to the chef, Claire replied. That sounds serious. Very serious. The man smiled again. It was remarkable how little effort he seemed to make, and yet how much attention he quietly commanded. Claire set down the plate and prepared to leave when he asked a question. If you own this restaurant, what would you change? She paused. Most customers discuss themselves. Few ever asked what she thought. That is a dangerous question. Why? Because you might get an honest answer. Those are usually the most valuable kind. Claire glanced around the dining room. The executives occupied the best seats. The investors occupied the best tables. Meanwhile, employees hurried through the room, trying to satisfy impossible expectations. I would start by teaching management that respect should not be reserved for people with money, she said. Interesting. I would also stop assuming that the person with the nicest suit is the most important person in the room. The stranger lowered his fork slightly. And how would you know who is important? Claire considered the question. Easy. Watch how they treat people who cannot do anything for them. For a moment, silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable silence. Thoughtful silence. The kind that lingered after something true had been spoken. Then he nodded slowly. That is a surprisingly rare answer. Claire offered a small smile. My father used to say that character becomes visible when status disappears. The stranger looked away briefly toward the rain-covered glass. Your father sounds wise. He was. Before she could say more, another table called her name. She excused herself and hurried away. Nearly 20 minutes later, while clearing dishes near the entrance, she noticed something unusual. A folded document rested beside the stranger's chair. He was no longer there. The seat sat empty. Curious, she picked it up to return it before someone else noticed. The paper was heavier than normal stationery. Expensive. Professional. At the top, she caught a glimpse of a company logo she immediately recognized. Hawthorne Hospitality Group, one of the largest restaurant corporations in the country. Her eyes widened. Beneath the logo were words that made her heart skip. Acquisition strategy. Confidential review. Claire immediately looked away. She did not read another line. Instead, she carefully folded the document exactly as she found it. A few seconds later, she spotted the stranger near the lobby speaking quietly on his phone. She walked over and extended the folder. "I think you forgot this." He looked down at the document, then back at her. For the first time all evening, genuine surprise appeared in his eyes. "You did not open it." Claire almost laughed. "It is not mine." The stranger accepted the folder slowly. Outside, thunder rolled once more across Manhattan. Inside, something invisible shifted between them, and neither of them noticed that someone across the room had been watching the entire exchange. Across the dining room, Richard Collins, the restaurant's general manager, narrowed his eyes. He had spent 15 years climbing through the hospitality industry and considered himself an expert at reading people. What he had just witnessed made no sense. A waitress had returned a confidential corporate document without even looking at it. The stranger had reacted as though that simple act mattered far more than it should have. Richard did not like mysteries, especially inside his restaurant. As the evening continued, he quietly observed every interaction between Claire and the man. The more he watched, the more irritated he became. Claire was one of his strongest employees, but she had an annoying habit of treating everyone exactly the same. Investors, celebrities, tourists, delivery drivers. To her, they were simply people. Richard considered that a weakness. In his world, priorities mattered. Status mattered. Connections mattered. Near closing time, Richard intercepted Claire near the service station. "I need you focusing on premium guests," he said sharply. "I am focusing on all guests." "That is not what I mean." Claire remained calm. "I know." Richard glanced toward the stranger's table. "You have spent enough time back there." Claire followed his gaze. The man sat quietly finishing a cup of coffee while reading notes inside the leather notebook she had noticed earlier. "He is a customer. He is a driver." The words landed heavily. Claire felt the familiar frustration she had experienced many times before. "He paid for dinner." "That is not the point." "Then what is the point?" Richard opened his mouth but seemed unable to find an answer that sounded reasonable out loud. Finally, he adjusted his tie and walked away. Claire returned to work. Yet she noticed something she had missed before. The stranger had clearly overheard every word. Still, his expression never changed. No anger, no embarrassment, just quiet observation. Later that night, as employees began preparing for closing, Claire delivered the final check. The stranger accepted it with a polite nod. "Thank you for tonight." "You are welcome." He studied her for a moment. "May I ask you one more question?" Claire smiled. "You seem to enjoy those. What would you do if someone handed you an opportunity that could change your life?" The question caught her off guard. She thought carefully before answering. "I would ask what it costs." A faint smile appeared. "Not everything comes with a price." "Maybe not. But everything comes with responsibility." For several seconds, he simply looked at her. Then he nodded as though confirming something only he understood. He signed the receipt, closed the folder, and stood. Claire noticed he moved with the confidence of someone completely comfortable in any room. Even this one. Especially this one. "Good night, Claire." She blinked. She had never told him her name. Before she could ask how he knew it, he was already walking toward the exit. Rain had finally stopped outside. The city lights reflected across the wet streets like scattered gold. The black sedan waited at the curb. But as the stranger approached, something unexpected happened. The driver standing beside the vehicle immediately opened the rear passenger door and stepped aside respectfully. Claire froze. So did several employees watching through the front window. The stranger thanked the driver, entered the back seat, and disappeared into the night. And for the first time since meeting him, Claire realized she might have been asking the wrong questions all along. Claire barely slept that night. The image kept replaying in her mind. The man she had assumed was a driver stepping into the back seat, while an actual chauffeur opened the door for him. The quiet confidence. The expensive watch. The confidential documents. The questions. None of it fit together anymore. By Friday morning, Manhattan had returned to its usual rhythm. Yellow taxis flooded the streets. Steam drifted from subway grates. People hurried through crosswalks carrying coffee cups and unfinished conversations. Claire arrived at the Hawthorne Room 15 minutes before her shift and immediately sensed something unusual. Employees were moving faster than normal. Managers appeared nervous. Fresh flower arrangements lined the entrance. Even Richard Collins looked tense as he paced near the reception desk, checking his watch every few minutes. What happened? Claire asked a coworker. You have not heard. Heard what? Corporate is coming today. Claire frowned. Corporate comes here all the time. Not like this. Her coworker lowered her voice. Apparently, the company that owns half the luxury restaurants in the country is considering a major acquisition. Executives are arriving this afternoon. Claire remembered the logo on the document she had returned. Hawthorne Hospitality Group. A strange feeling settled in her stomach. Throughout the morning, managers held meetings. Staff received instructions. Every detail was inspected. Every table was adjusted. Every employee was reminded to be perfect. By early afternoon, black vehicles began arriving outside. Men and women in tailored suits entered the building carrying portfolios and tablets. The atmosphere shifted immediately. Suddenly, everyone seemed desperate to impress people they had never met. Claire continued working as usual. She greeted guests, refilled water glasses, delivered meals. Yet she could not ignore the growing tension around her. Then, shortly after 3 o'clock, Richard approached her. His expression was unusually serious. Claire. Yes. I need you upstairs. She blinked. Upstairs. Conference level. Her heart skipped. Employees rarely visited the executive conference floor. Why? Richard adjusted his tie. I do not know. Which meant he absolutely knew. He simply was not saying. A few minutes later, Claire stepped into the elevator alone. As the doors closed, she felt an uncomfortable mix of curiosity and anxiety. The elevator climbed slowly. Floor 4, Floor 5, Floor 6. When the doors finally opened, she found herself standing in a hallway lined with framed photographs of luxury hotels and restaurants from across the country. At the far end, a large conference room stood partially open. Voices drifted through the doorway. Claire took a breath and walked forward. The closer she got, the quieter the room seemed to become. One executive after another turned toward her. Several managers stood along the walls. Investors occupied seats around a polished table that stretched nearly 30 feet across the room. Claire stopped at the entrance. Her pulse quickened. Then she saw the man sitting at the head of the table. The leather notebook rested beside him. The same calm eyes met hers. The same quiet expression. But this time nobody ignored him. Nobody looked past him. Every person in the room was watching him instead. And as Claire stood frozen in the doorway, she realized the stranger from the corner table was not attending the meeting. He was leading it. For a moment, Claire wondered if she had entered the wrong room. The polished conference table stretched across the center like something from a movie. Executives sat perfectly still. Investors who controlled fortunes worth hundreds of millions of dollars waited quietly. Even Richard Collins stood near the wall with the rigid posture of someone afraid to speak out of turn. And at the head of the table sat the man she had served dinner to less than 24 hours earlier. Nathan Walker, the stranger she had assumed was a driver. The room remained silent as Claire stood frozen in the doorway. Nathan rose from his chair. Not hurriedly, not dramatically, calmly, the same way he had done everything else. Miss Bennett, he said, thank you for joining us. Every eye in the room shifted toward her. Claire felt heat rise into her cheeks. I am sorry, she said carefully. I think there must be some mistake. A faint smile touched Nathan's face. There is no mistake. He gestured toward an empty chair near the center of the table. Please sit down. Claire hesitated before taking a seat. The atmosphere felt unreal. Just yesterday, she had been carrying plates and refilling water glasses. Now she sat among people whose watches alone probably cost more than her yearly salary. Nathan returned to his chair. For those who have not met her, this is Claire Bennett. Nobody spoke. Several executives exchanged curious glances. Nathan folded his hands. Yesterday, I spent the evening observing this property. Claire noticed Richard shift uncomfortably. I believe leadership is easiest to evaluate when nobody realizes they are being evaluated, Nathan continued. Titles create performances. Status creates masks. I prefer honesty. The room grew even quieter. One investor nodded slowly. Another began taking notes. Nathan's gaze settled briefly on Claire before moving around the table. I observed service standards, management practices, team culture, customer engagement. His voice remained calm, yet every word carried weight. Some results were encouraging. Others were disappointing. Richard swallowed visibly. Claire noticed it immediately. Then Nathan reached into his notebook and opened several pages. I also observed something else. He paused. Character. The word seemed to hang in the air. Last night, one employee treated every individual with equal respect regardless of perceived status. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. That employee returned confidential documents without reading them, offered honest opinions when asked, defended people who could do nothing for her career, and remained professional even when discouraged from doing so. Claire felt her stomach tighten. Nathan was talking about her. Across the table, several executives were now looking directly at her. Richard stared down at the polished surface in front of him. Nathan closed the notebook. Many companies claim they value integrity. Very few know how to recognize it. Then he looked directly at Claire. Which is why you are here today. Claire opened her mouth, searching for words, but none came. The mystery was finally unraveling. Yet somehow the truth felt even larger than she imagined. Because Nathan Walker was not simply attending the acquisition meeting. He was the founder, majority owner, and chief executive officer of Hawthorne Hospitality Group. And the entire room had just learned that the person who impressed him most during his visit was not an executive, not an investor, not a manager. It was a waitress. Claire sat perfectly still as the room absorbed Nathan's words. Nobody seemed to know what to say next. A few executives shifted in their seats. Others studied the documents in front of them as if searching for an escape from the uncomfortable truth hanging over the table. Richard Collins looked especially uneasy. For years he had believed leadership was measured by revenue reports, performance reviews, and exclusive client lists. Now the chief executive officer of one of the largest hospitality companies in America was talking about integrity instead. Nathan allowed the silence to linger. He seemed to understand something many powerful people never learned. The truth often needed a moment to settle before people could face it. Finally, one of the investors cleared his throat. "Mr. Walker," he said carefully, "are you suggesting that a single interaction influenced your evaluation of this property?" Nathan leaned back slightly. Not a single interaction. His voice remained calm. A pattern. He folded his hands. People reveal who they are through small decisions. The world notices grand gestures. Character hides in ordinary moments. Several people nodded. Others avoided eye contact. Nathan glanced toward Claire. "Yesterday I was ignored, dismissed, and underestimated by several individuals." The words landed softly, but their impact was unmistakable. That was useful information. Nobody spoke. But Miss Bennett behaved differently. Claire wished the floor would open beneath her chair. She was not used to being the center of attention. Certainly not in a room like this. Nathan continued. "When she believed I was a driver, she offered the same respect she would offer a billionaire." A faint smile crossed his face. Ironically, that is much harder to find than most people realize. One executive laughed quietly. Another shook his head. Nathan opened a folder resting beside him. This acquisition was originally scheduled for final approval today. A ripple moved around the table. However, before finalizing anything, I wanted to understand the culture inside this property. He looked directly at Richard. Culture is not what managers write in employee handbooks. Culture is what employees experience when nobody important is watching. Richard's face grew pale. Claire almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Then Nathan surprised everyone again. He turned back toward Claire. "Yesterday, I asked you what you would change if you owned this restaurant." Claire nodded cautiously. "Yes." "Would you still give the same answer today?" Every eye returned to her. Her heart pounded. Yet something about Nathan's expression made her feel unexpectedly calm. He was not testing her. He genuinely wanted the truth. Claire took a breath. "Yes." A few executives exchanged glances. Nathan smiled slightly. Even now, especially now, the room became completely silent. Claire met his gaze. Respect should not depend on job titles. And importance should not depend on who has the biggest office. For a second, nobody moved. Then Nathan slowly nodded. Not because she impressed him, not because she agreed with him, but because she had just proven she was exactly the same person whether she was speaking to a driver or a chief executive officer. The atmosphere inside the conference room changed after that. The discussion was no longer about numbers, contracts, or acquisition timelines. It had become something much more uncomfortable. A conversation about values. Nathan allowed the silence to settle before opening another folder. "Over the past year," he said, "our company has invested heavily in leadership development." Several executives nodded. They were familiar with the initiative. "We have hired consultants, conducted evaluations, designed training programs." Nathan closed the folder again. Yet some of the most valuable lessons never appear in a seminar. His eyes moved around the table. Sometimes they appeared during dinner. A few nervous smiles appeared. Others looked away. Claire remained quiet. She still felt like she had accidentally wandered into someone else's story. Nathan stood and walked slowly toward the windows overlooking Manhattan. She did not. Claire shifted slightly in her chair. I was just doing what seemed right. Nathan smiled. Exactly. The answer seemed to satisfy him more than any speech could have. Then he surprised everyone again. Which brings me to the real reason I asked her here today. Every head turned. Even Richard looked confused. Nathan returned to his seat and opened a final folder. 3 months ago, we launched a new initiative focused on community engagement and employee development. He slid a document across the table toward Claire. The program needs leadership. Claire looked down. Her name appeared at the top of the page. She blinked, then looked again. The name remained there. I do not understand, she admitted softly. Nathan leaned forward. I am offering you a position. The room froze. Not because you are perfect. His voice remained calm. Not because you have executive experience. He smiled slightly. And certainly not because you expected any of this. A few people laughed quietly. I am offering it because character can be taught to almost no one. Skills can be taught to almost everyone. Claire stared at the document. Her hands trembled slightly. Not from fear. From disbelief. 24 hours earlier, she had been carrying trays through a crowded dining room. Now one of the most powerful executives in the hospitality industry was asking her to help shape the culture of an entire organization. Nathan watched her reaction carefully. Then he said something she would remember for the rest of her life. The company already has enough people who understand business. What it needs is more people who understand people. Claire stared at the document for several long seconds. The letters on the page did not change. Her name remained there. The offer remained real. Around her, executives who had spent years climbing corporate ladders watched quietly as a waitress considered an opportunity most people would never receive. Finally, she looked up. Why me? The question escaped before she could stop it. Nathan seemed unsurprised. In fact, he appeared to have been expecting it. He leaned back slightly and smiled. Because yesterday you showed me something I cannot teach. Claire glanced around the room. I only did my job. No, Nathan replied gently. You did much more than that. The room remained silent as he continued. You treated people with respect before you knew who they were. You protected information that was not yours. You spoke honestly when it would have been easier to stay quiet. Most importantly, you remained the same person before and after learning the truth. Claire lowered her eyes. She had never thought of those actions as extraordinary. To her, they were simply normal. That seemed to be exactly Nathan's point. The strongest foundations are usually invisible, he said. Character works the same way. For the first time all afternoon, Claire smiled. A small smile. A genuine one. Nathan noticed. So did everyone else. The tension that had filled the room slowly faded. Outside the conference room windows, Manhattan continued moving beneath the late afternoon sun. Cars flowed through crowded streets. People hurried between buildings. Millions of stories unfolding at once. Yet for Claire, everything had changed. Not because she had been offered a new position. Not because she was sitting among executives. But because she finally understood what the past 2 days had really been about. It had never been a test